Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. I'm so thrilled to be hosting you and a special guest who will be joining us just very shortly to discuss and mark the 81st anniversary of Winston Churchill becoming Prime Minister today. My name is Justin Reash, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, this society is, and we want to thank all of our members who are joining us today. If you're not yet a member, I greatly encourage you to do so by going to winstonchurchill.org/join. Today's special guest, and I'm incredibly thrilled to have him, is Erik Larson, author of numerous best-selling books, including The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. Erik, thank you for joining us and for taking time out of your busy schedule to do so.
Thank you very much for having me.
So before we begin, I would like all of the audience members to know two things. First, this event is being recorded, and so you'll be able to watch it on our YouTube page afterwards. Second, we want you to engage with us as much as possible during this event. So please use the question and answer function on Zoom to submit your questions, and I will try my hardest to have Erik answer as many as possible. So Erik, let's begin, if I may do so, by asking you, how have you and your loved ones fared during this past year of the global pandemic?
I am very thankful to say that we have fared very well. I mean, we've had losses in the extended family, but immediate, we've done very, very well.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And it leads me to my next question, which I know many of us are very eager to hear your answer to. So you and I last spoke about this book in February of 2020 when I hosted an audio interview with you for our monthly e-newsletter, Churchill Bulletin. And we all knew that there was this virus coming and there was going to be some sort of interruption. But as an author who was launching a highly anticipated book, how did the experience of the past year change the way you promote your book and how people engaged with your book?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that launching the book in February of 2020, I remember vividly that I had my first event in Brooklyn, New York on the evening of February 24th. The 25th, I set out on the physical tour by plane to visit as many places as I could. We knew there was a virus out there. I don't think anybody really expected it was really going to come to the United States in this sort of crisis mode. I mean, I think at that point it had struck Seattle pretty badly. But certainly when I set out, I really was not anticipating what eventually occurred. I was wary. I stopped doing the handshake thing after a book talk. I stopped shaking hands. I was still signing books though, and I have always been careful about Purelling on planes and so forth. But when I knew that things were really starting to get a little bit crazy, the watershed moment was, okay, detail here. I was in the men's room at O'Hare Airport, and there was a line of men at each sink. Then you knew this virus had gotten everybody's attention. And the thing went to a screaming halt on March 12th, coincidentally my wife's birthday. And a big event I had that night in, I think it was Tulsa, Oklahoma, with the mayor. It was going to be a big thing, just suddenly screeched to a dead halt. The synagogue where we were going to do the interview recovered beautifully and did a terrific, video interview with the mayor and me. And it was really, really a lot of fun. Next morning, I was on a plane back to New York, and 4 days later, we were locked down at our house out on Long Island. What did this do in terms of launching a book? I was very lucky to do the thing that you really want to do when you have a book, is get out fast, get out ahead, and hopefully make the bestseller lists. I made those lists before everything came to a crashing halt. Then it became a question of okay, how do you deal with events that have been canceled? Everything got canceled. Thus, I entered the age of Zoom, for better or worse. You know, I mean, it was just like such a novel change to suddenly be doing all these virtual events. Now, in the end, I feel pretty comfortable now with Zoom. Am I looking forward to potentially the physical tour for the paperback, which should be in the spring? Yes, very much. But it worked out. Another novel thing though was this was totally unexpected to me. For some reason, people seem to adopt my book. People seem to come to the book for solace during the pandemic. It was as though in reading about Churchill and how he confronted this cataclysm, true leadership at a time where there was a real absence, I feel here, frankly, true leadership, how they confronted the unimaginable in Britain and yet did. And I think that really helped people. So I found people coming to my book in ways that I would not have expected.
And I will say, not only have, myself, and I think I can speak for the majority of members for the International Church Society, enjoyed this incredible book and unique tale. But it seems like the public have as well, because I don't know if you've checked this, but you currently have 18,800 reviews on Amazon, which I would say as a frequent Amazon user is an incredible amount of reviews.
I think I've ever had that many. Of course, some of them are probably raving at me for my political views. So I don't ever look at the Amazon reviews.
Yeah.
Probably death threats on there. I don't know.
Oh my God. Well,
I'm not saying that there are, but
well, going from just one very small metric, it certainly seems to have not only sold well, but struck a nerve. And I think to your point of we always talk about on this day, 81 years ago, Winston Churchill was the right man at the right time. And if I may say, it seems like the book, like you just said, came out at the right time, right book at the right time to discuss such an integral leader in history.
Yeah. No, I mean, it definitely. I think that's really what drew people to the book was this idea of that once upon a time there was actual leadership that could get you through a problem like the pandemic, and I think that is what really brought people to the story. It's almost like reading a positive bedtime story. You go to bed at night reading the story, and it takes you out of your current world into this other world where people were enduring this horror, and yet we're doing it. We're surviving. So it was a real novel effect.
Of course. So let's get into the book. And I would like to remind everyone on the call, please submit your questions via Q&A, and we will certainly have Erik answer as many as possible. He may have to speed answer all of them, speak a mile a minute, but we'll get to as many as possible. So thank you for your participation.
Ask them yes and no questions.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful yes and no questions. So the book begins at the title of this discussion, which is When Churchill Became Prime Minister. And, the first chapter is When the Coroner Departs, which, Neville Chamberlain has such a bad rap these days, and which I think is slightly unfair. But the coroner, just as a nickname, just doesn't help anyone in history. And then it ends.
The other nickname for Chamberlain was the Old Umbrella.
The Old Umbrella, that's right. So two very unflattering nicknames. And then the book ends with the cessation of the Blitz of London. Tell us why you decided to tackle topics such as Churchill within that time frame.
So I have to tell you that I did not come to this book because of Churchill. I mean, the sequence of events. It was eventually led to Churchill, but the sequence of events was that we have been living in Seattle, Washington, and step back, a decade, we had seen, the 9/11 disaster unfold in real time on CNN and so forth. Fast forward, we moved to Manhattan from Seattle. Our kids had flown the coop, so we figured, why not? I've always wanted to live in Manhattan. I arrived in the city and almost immediately realized that the effect of 9/11 on people who actually lived here was so much more jarring and vivid and wrenching than anything that I experienced in Seattle, despite having watched this thing unfold. Now, that probably sounds like a duh observation, but it came to me very, very keenly. And I started thinking, well, then, I've always been interested vaguely in the Blitz, but I never had any idea how to go about it. It was so heavily written about. And it gives me this thought, like, if we were so traumatized by that single event, 9/11, how on earth did the British get, how did Londoners get through in one phase of the Blitz, the phase we actually know as the Blitz? How did Londoners get through 57 consecutive nights of bombing, essentially 57 consecutive 9/11s? I started thinking, well, how does anybody survive that? And I started thinking, well, maybe there's a book in how the typical London family actually did go about surviving it. Then I thought, wait a minute, instead of the typical London family, how about the quintessential London family and Churchill and his family? But do it not in the sort of traditional political biography approach, but try to get into how he and his family and his close advisors, who were almost family members, how did they actually go about surviving this ordeal on a daily basis? The ins and outs, the meals, the Churchill, the booze, how did this all unfold in real time? So that's what drew me to it.
And I find that fascinating. You're, if I may say, as someone who's read all of your books, the reason I think your books resonate so much is that you're able to bring anecdotal experiences of an everyday person, bring them to the fore, and then weave them into a greater conversation and greater story. I think about like you said, how does any family, but let's focus on the Churchills, how do they do what they do during that time? And I mean, what I've always found fascinating about Churchill is the man took a nap, or tried to take a nap, for many hours during the day. And even I've wondered, how could he have possibly done that, not only during the Blitz and prime ministership, but in general in life?
Yeah, no, he napped every day, he took baths every day, and probably these were the things that helped keep him sane throughout that tormented period. But I mean, getting a glimpse of his daily life, I found it. I mean, I really found it fascinating. Yeah, I tried to drill down even into the level of how they stocked their wine cellar at the prime ministerial country estate Chequers. Because it was not easy to do on the government. There's an entertainment fund that the government had to require all these rules for how to serve wine and keep track of who got what when. So I was really compelled by all those fine details, and so it was because I had that window, looking for the intimate details on a daily basis of how this particular family dealt with this. The end result was that I think I produced something that, as hard as that is in the world of Churchill, something that's pretty fresh because of that perspective. So anyway.
So speaking about when he actually became prime minister and the weeks leading up to it, as you learned with your research, and I'd love to know your insight into this. He, for the English political elite in May and April of 1940, Churchill was not the next man up. And so, was that surprising to you as someone who came to Churchill, not late, but as your book developed, what surprised you when during those 6 weeks from, let's say, the invasion of Narvik to May 10th?
Yeah, no, it did survive. It surprised me. I think that's one of the beauties of coming to it. I'm not a Churchill scholar. So the bad news is I have to spend a long time reading all the classic works to try to catch up to a certain level of competence in the field. The good news is I see things fresh in the way that readers who are not familiar with Churchill are going to see them fresh, and I see things that are going to surprise people. And one of those for me was that Churchill, we all know Churchill spent his time in the so-called the wilderness, after World War I. He's sort of basically out of power, frustrated with the whole deal. But in this run up to May 10, 1940, when he became prime minister, he really was not well thought of in many quarters in Whitehall. And I found that kind of fascinating. But I also found it equally fascinating that in the end, in that period, he was the guy who was anointed to do this, even though, looking at the political environment through which he had just come, you would think that maybe he was the last guy on the list. But no, he rose to the occasion, and he was, sort of thrust forward by the rebels who had thrown Chamberlain out.
And there's this interesting dichotomy, which I always find fascinating, is that the English political elite weren't interested, at least the leaders, the majority leaders of the Tory party, up until those final few days, May 8th, 9th. But the public, what I love about your book is that you use sources such as mass observation and other things like that. The public had a much different point of view. Can you detail how, what those sources, what those sources told you about the public's feelings about Winston Churchill?
Well, first of all, the public really did have a very different sense of it. They thought that Churchill was, in fact, the hero of the age, as Churchill himself liked to paint himself. So there was the public perception of Churchill, and then there was the perception of those, the politicals around him. The sources that are available on the subject are they run a gamut of very compelling things. And again, I'm coming to this stuff fresh. So when I first came across the diary of John Colville, Churchill's, one of his private secretaries, which is, I think it's safe to say, is the firsthand, intimate, day-to-day diary account of the Churchill prime ministry. And I would go so far as to say that without that diary, we would have much less of a rich sense of Churchill than we do. So, reading Colville's diary, for example, that's why I first came across Colville's, total disdain for Churchill.
Yes.
Churchill was sort of this cheap guy, and he was going to wear his cheapest bright blue suit to sort of commemorate Churchill becoming prime minister, and then Colville himself starts to realize, wait a minute, this guy's okay. Even the king did not want Churchill to be prime minister, but over time he got to the point where he said in his diary, he said, I cannot imagine a better prime minister than Winston Churchill. But then you have the broader range of documents and materials. Mass observation, you mentioned, is something that very important to me in the course of this book. For one thing, again, the value of the layman stumbling into this world. I had never heard of mass observation before I began this book. And when I did, it was like I died and gone to heaven. Mass observation, for those who aren't familiar with it, mass observation was a civilian social research entity that was established well before the war to try to get a sense of ordinary British life. So they recruited dozens, scores of diarists to keep track of their daily lives, to the point where the test to see whether you wanted to actually join this cadre of diarists was you had to record what was on your mantelpiece or on your neighbor's mantelpiece, just to get a sense of the texture that was wanted by this thing. So people were dutifully keeping these diaries. They were giving a glimpse of the really mundane aspects of life in Britain. Then comes the war, and many of those diarists continued to keep their diaries. And suddenly these diaries become this rich window on the real nature of war and how terrifying it was, and the politics and so forth. And that was really invaluable. So,
yeah. And speaking of source material, you got quite a few questions, and I'd just like to thank CeeLo Morello, Faye Turner, and Robert. They all asked the same question, which I'll condense into one, which is, what were some of the new sources of material that you drew from?
The new sources?
Yes. So speaking of, and please go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the best sources, and define new. This was a diary that was done back in the period, 1940-41, but was only made available to me. I was one of two who had ever seen this diary when I was doing the research for the book. And that's the diary of Mary Churchill, who was Churchill's, at that point, youngest, what I like to put it, his youngest living daughter, because they had lost a child very young before this. And Mary Churchill kept this very detailed diary. She's sort of where John Colville was the diarist who really let us into the workings of 10 Downing Street. Mary is the diarist who really let us deep into the heart of the Churchill family during this period. She was 17 years old when the action began. Very articulate, smart observer of events around her, but also really, she was a 17-year-old girl who loved to have fun. She loved to have fun. She liked to go out dancing with at the RAF parties, occasionally, as she puts in her diary, snogging in the hayloft. This juxtaposed against things that she wrote about her father, and when things were going badly for her father, the grief that she felt for him, the love that she felt for him, and also her own frustration of not being able to be a part of the war because her parents, especially Clementine, her parents were very protective. They didn't want her in the fray. They were concerned for her safety. And she, of course, being 17, she was not. She wanted to jump into this thing. And eventually, of course, she did. That was an incredibly powerful source. I also came across a lot of recently, well, I don't want to say recently unclassified, but a lot of unclassified materials that, because of the nature of my project, essentially were new. Because people who had gone through these things before, if you're writing the massive Andrew Roberts biography of Churchill, you're not necessarily going to be interested in these fine-grained interrogation reports by British intelligence of German flyers, for example. It was gold. It was incredibly valuable to me. So various sources like that.
And I will say, Mary Soames not only left an incredible diary, but left an incredible mark on the society herself. She was the patron of the society from the mid 80s to her death in 2014. So I'm so glad that her daughter Emma allowed you to look at those. That's so that was incredible.
To me, honestly, my feeling is it made the book.
Yeah. And so if I can talk a little bit about the longer part of the book. So we talked about Churchill becoming prime minister, discussed how he really wasn't the person expected to take over. There's a great question from Joanne, who said,
I should throw something in there, by the way. He was not expected to become prime minister, but throughout his entire, I think it's fair to say almost his entire political life, he knew that one day he would be prime minister. That was his absolute be-all goal. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No. But that is a testament to the man's, what I would argue, the man's macro vision. That's the way he thought. So the reason why Neville Chamberlain didn't kick him out of the cabinet after the Narvik disaster is that he recognized Churchill could see around not just the next corner, but the next two corners. Right. So he had this ability to see, and it just also happened to be in his own personal accomplishments as well.
Right.
Joanne asks, what are your views on Churchill's first three speeches before the House of Commons after he becomes prime minister?
What are my views on them?
Yeah, and how impactful and important are those? Of course, those are the blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Yeah, I mean, very, very powerful. Churchill's speeches, I think, were one of his secret weapons as a leader. And what I admired was that, not just the first three speeches, but during this first year, which I would argue is the period when the speeches we all know to be the big Churchill speeches occurred during this one year period. But I think the important thing about the way he did his speeches, and I'm going to use one example that I think is the most important, and that's the Dunkirk speech. Mm-hmm. After when it became clear that the evacuation of Dunkirk was proceeding in ways that nobody could possibly have expected. And he was very he would frame his speeches first with a very direct, sober appraisal of what was happening. He was not trying to snow people with happy talk or whatever. Then he would come with an optimistic approach to why we're going to survive this, why this is a temporary historical setback. And then comes the rhetoric that we all know and love, the soaring final speeches, these phrases of we will fight on the beaches, we will fight on the whatever, and those were incredibly stirring to people, and so yeah, he galvanized people. I think those first three speeches were wonderful. I think all of his speeches were very much worth studying and for their impact on helping the culture survive this.
And they provided the inspiration for everyone to keep going. I mean, you discussed in your book his visits to the rubble of London and the people who he would have tears in his eyes and he would be incredibly moved. And then the people who had just had their homes bombed go up to him to encourage him. Say, you've led us, let's keep going.
Yeah, well, he would be tears in his eyes. He would be openly sobbing. I mean, it's worth talking about. You know, after the first deliberate bombing of London, which was September 7th, 1940, I believe. After the first deliberate bombing, and I have to couch that because until then, Hitler actually was very reluctant to have German bombers bomb London itself, because he still had this hope that he could bring Churchill to the peace table and take Britain out of the war. So September 7th, there's this savage attack by German aircraft. The next day, Churchill, against the advice of advisors, goes out to the Docklands to the East London, where it's been savaged by this attack, with the idea of visiting the wreckage and going out among the people and seeing what had occurred. The one close advisor was very reluctant to have him do that. This is Pug Ismay, General Hastings Ismay, because he didn't know what the reaction would be. Would the people be aggressive towards him for having let the Germans do this to us? So it was a real question of what was going to happen when he arrived. Gets there, gets out of the car, he tours this ravaged area, and he is overcome with emotion, and instantly wins the hearts and souls of the East End of London with this visit. That's a powerful aspect of his leadership, actually, one that he continued throughout the war, really, and it represents in microcosm this broader ability of his. He understood the power of symbolic acts. He understood that doing something simple like that had a power way beyond. Similarly, he would react to air raids in ways sort of not typical for Londoners. When a raid would occur, Churchill was more likely than not to race to the nearest rooftop to watch the raid unfold. And the word about his courage got around. I mean, courage, fearlessness, as I like to put it, fearlessness is infectious, and these various acts were helping to convey to people that maybe they could overcome their fear, and we're going to get through this. One of my favorite scenes is when he's having dinner with a U.S. diplomat and some others at the fortified apartment in the building above what we now know as the Churchill War Room. And there is an air raid occurs, and he decides to bring his guests up onto the rooftop to watch this raid unfold. And there, Churchill, watching this thing unfold, he quotes Tennyson. This is the kind of composure this guy had. He quotes a poem by Tennyson called Locksley Hall, which, when you read this, it seems to foretell the advent of aerial warfare. So, that's the kind of leader he was. That's the kind of message that got out to the people around him.
And it's akin to setting aside politics, but bring it back to your first comment about why you wrote the book. It's akin to when George Bush showed up on Ground Zero.
Yes.
And I remember watching as a then 11-year-old boy, and that. So, but to your point, the symbolic act of leadership was Churchill's forte.
Yep. No, very much so. Another element, though, if I could just spin back to briefly to his speeches. One thing that's very important about Churchill is he was of course an avid reader of history. He knew history. He knew world history. And he knew the importance of understanding history. And whenever he would give his talks, his speeches, he had this way of putting his listeners into the broad, grand sweep of British history, as if making them feel like, okay, they're part of this story. They, whether we're going to continue this great island story of ours, as I think he put it at one time, is going to be partly up to them to fit themselves into this great history.
And there's a question from an anonymous person, and I'll just answer if you don't mind. He asked, he or she asked, did Churchill write all his own speeches, or did others draft them for review? Churchill dictated his own speeches to a secretary and then would rewrite them himself. And then actually there are final drafts that he would take to Parliament that have been kept of him making changes but it's a testament to his, like you said, Erik, his knowledge, his intellect, and really the message coming from him.
Well, and think about this for a second also, just the level of intellect and the quality of being able to articulate, these very complex sentences and so forth on the fly, while walking around a room with a cigar and I mean, I can't dictate an order to the local fresh direct delivery company.
Yes, for those who are Erik Larson fans, and this is your first intro to Churchill, Winston Churchill was known for many things, but one of them was that he would, like I said earlier, he'd nap during the day, he'd have a very, very long dinner, and then around 10 p.m., 11 p.m., he would begin working. And he would keep up a poor secretary until 2, 3, 4 a.m. to dictate to his writings and his speeches.
Till whenever. And by the way, by footnote, as I want to do, I hope people can see over my left shoulder, there is a little Churchill effigy next to a Tony Fauci bobblehead doll, by the way, I should point out. And if you look over a little bit further, there is actually a bottle of whiskey with Kamala Harris on it.
Oh, wow.
Made by a distillery in Washington, D.C.
Wonderful.
Anyway, footnote.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing it out. Everyone loves Churchilliana. So I'd like to ask a question for Dr. Eamon O'Neill in Scotland. Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. This goes back to Churchill's humanity and your brilliant ability to really describe it throughout your book. He says, I was lucky enough to know and spend time with Sir Martin Gilbert in the 1990s. Of course, Sir Martin Gilbert, for those who don't know, Churchill's official biographer. He always told me that Churchill's innate sensitivity and humanity was often missed in his image. Your book goes down that more human route. Was this a conscious decision by you or one which emanated from your research?
Very good question. I think this also cuts to the value of coming at something as without having the expertise of years and years of study. I know exactly what this gentleman in Scotland is talking about. I think that the benefit that I had coming at this fresh, this was not a deliberate thing on my part to bring out this humane, sensitive element of Churchill. It's there. It's there. It hits you in the face when you go through the materials. He mentions Martin Gilbert. One thing that Martin Gilbert did, yes, there is his biography, which is of course wonderful, authoritative, and so forth. But even more impressive and important is he produced a series of volumes of the original documents that went into the creation of his books. The war, what's it called? Need to refresh me. The war documents or the war papers of Winston.
It's called the companion volumes.
Yes, but the title is like the war papers or the war documents.
Yes, yeah.
These things are incredible. I mean, each volume is 1,500 to 1,700 pages, tiny type, thin paper, and so forth. It's just wonderful. And when you go through these documents, of course, many, many others, Churchill's humanity is just there. It's just there. But and you can bring it out if you're talking about in the context where you want to bring out somebody's humanity, which is what you want to do when you're talking about family and surviving this awful situation. It wasn't a political biography.
Yes. I'd like to thank everyone. We have many questions, and they're great questions. Please continue. I'd like to ask one from Eric. He says, do you feel that Churchill's sad experience at the Dardanelles of Gallipoli served as a motivator for him to excel as a war leader and added to his ability to have an emotional connection to the citizens of London during the Blitz? And Eric, if I may say one quick thing to add to Eric's question, Erik Larson, add to Eric's question. Eric, the questioner, you may know this, but if you don't, and for those who don't know, immediately after Gallipoli, Winston Churchill resigned. Where did he go? He spent 11 months on the front of the Western Front in Flanders, leading his regiment. That is leadership. So continue, please, Eric, please answer that question.
So do I think that this had any particular influence on how he dealt with the Blitz? I would have to think about that a lot longer. I don't want to just spout whatever. I mean, I have to think about that a lot longer and look at the source material to see if there is any sort of direct connection that I can make, because I don't really see one at the moment.
Sure.
I think what Churchill mostly was driven by was this desire to get back into the action, by whatever you want to define action. He wanted to become a political presence again, to get out of the wilderness. And it was sort of a miracle, really, that Chamberlain made him First Lord of the Admiralty. Again, that was his second tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty after his disastrous experience with the whole Gallipoli thing. So that was a real motivating factor. But I can't make it a sane, informed tie to the event.
Yeah, fair enough. And to your point, when he was made First Lord of the Admiralty second time, that's when the famous telegram went out to the Navy: Winston is back.
Winston is back. Yep.
A great question from Diana. She asked, what role do you think Churchill's wit played in his leadership style?
His wit?
Yes, wit.
Oh, I think it played a tremendous role. He was a very funny man, personally, and also in his speeches, and especially in his repartee with irascible members of the House of Commons. I think that, I think to be a great leader, you have to have a sense of humor. I do. And one of the things that actually really surprised me, again, coming to this all fresh, was how much fun Churchill was. I mean, now his staff, John Colville, private secretary, his other private secretaries, they were not shy about noting that he could be a brutal boss, utterly inconsiderate, kept him up to all hours, but they loved him. And a big part of why they loved him, especially John Colville, I came to believe, was because of this almost childlike ability to grasp the humor in things. I mean, he had this way of, he could be really down in the dumps. He could be dealing with some crisis, and then, he slowly comes out of it, maybe with the help of a glass of sherry or whiskey and water. Little whiskey, lots of water, by the way. Yeah. But in the next breath, he'd be telling, there's one example John Colville writes about where they're all sharing dirty stories. And my favorite moment, though, the Lord Tennyson, quoting Tennyson poem during an era, that's one of my favorites. But I think probably my all-time favorite is during after a big meal at Chequers. Again, that's the prime ministerial estate, which frankly I think was Churchill's secret weapon. He turns on the gramophone and starts playing military marches. And he gets his big Malachir rifle, bayonet attached, and he proceeds to do bayonet drills in the Great Hall at Chequers with all of his guests gathered around. But here's the thing, he is wearing at this point his pale blue siren suit, a one-piece, basically, pull-on jumpsuit of his own design. Underneath his flaming red dragon silk robe, as he's very seriously doing bayonet drills in the Great Hall at Chequers. The people around him were in hysterics, watching the prime minister doing this thing. Anyway, he was a lot of fun, apparently.
Well, I don't know much about Mr. Chamberlain, but I doubt he would be doing that at 2 a.m. after
No, not really.
I know we only have a little less than 20 minutes left, so thank you everyone for questions. We'll continue. Sorry, excuse me. I just found one, and then of course.
Can I throw out something else also?
Go ahead.
Since I was on the subject of Chequers, this is one of the things that really did surprise me, was the extent to which Churchill used Chequers almost every weekend, going out to this estate and bringing with him generals, international leaders, everybody getting together around the dinner table. And one of my fantasies is to somehow be transported back in time to one of those dinners at Chequers, any dinner at Chequers, And it was, when I said earlier it was his secret weapon, I meant that because even he argued that this was a way where he got to know what was really going on from the people around him, the generals, the politicians, and so forth. Take him out of Whitehall, put them around the dinner table, you're going to learn things that are in a very different way. And the understanding was that what is spoken about at Chequers stays at Chequers. And it was a great way for him to get a real good sense of grounded truth, So, and I found that fascinating.
A question from Kevin: how did you arrive at this title, and did you consider any others?
Yeah, I had a number of titles going into the book, but when I came across a particular element of the book, I knew at once that this was going to be the title. So, back to John Colville's diary. John Colville, the private secretary who kept this very detailed diary against government rules. By the way, he could have been, seriously punished or even, I think, possibly jailed for keeping this diary.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. But anyway, so Colville, at one point, an air raid occurs. He's at his parents' house, and he decides to watch this air raid from the window of an upstairs bedroom. He watches this unfold. It's a beautiful night. There are, searchlights, bombs, the red glare of tracer bullets and so forth. And he's really struck by the beauty of this night. And he says it was this incredible juxtaposition of natural splendor and human vileness. And as soon as I read that line, I had my tongue. It stayed with me.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to weave in the incredible story of potential peacemaker, or so he thought, Rudolph Hess?
I will gladly tell you the story. It's a little long, a little roundabout here, but here's the thing. Not only did I want to come to this to sort of find out how the average citizen in London, how the quintessential family dealt with the Blitz and so forth, I was also drawn to the subject as a writer, by the potential for organic narrative power. When I say organic narrative power, by that I mean not making anything up, nothing like that at all, but what's inherent in this story that imparts to it narrative drive or narrative form. And the more I got into the story, the more I saw all these interesting things converging on the end of that one year. He becomes Prime Minister May 10, 1940. May 10, 1941, literally that day, this first bombing campaign, that's how I like to refer to it, not as the Blitz, but this first bombing campaign, year-long bombing campaign of the Germans came to an end. And essentially the most important air campaign of the war conducted by Germany came to an end that day. But other things, yes, there were subsequent flare-ups of Luftwaffe activity and of course the V rockets and so forth. But also on May 10th, Mary, his daughter Mary, who's had this wrenching romantic situation, that comes to an end on May 10th. And the week before, Churchill faces a challenge in the House of Commons that he has to fight off in sort of a very funny way, if only because the people who were challenging him, he called their bluff, and they were like, we're not really challenging your role as Prime Minister. We're just asking questions about the war. Anyways, it was very fun. But also that day, May 10, 1941, Rudolph Hess, Hitler's number 2 guy. Well, on paper, the number 2 guy, but in terms of power, he was the number 3 guy. Parachutes into Scotland, out of the blue, parachutes into Scotland. And when I saw all these things converging on May 10th, 1941, I thought, as a writer, I have died and gone to heaven. So, so that's why Hess was in there. And also because it's just insane.
It's insane. I'm sorry to interrupt you, so please continue.
No, well, it's insane. And it also gave me an opportunity. One of the things that I love is looking for texture in the sources that I bring to a narrative. I love having lists. I love having brief telegrams, brief chapters, all that stuff to add sort of a pace and texture to a narrative. And when I came across in some classified documents, and nobody's ever used this list. This is another thing that I love. There was a list compiled by British intelligence of all the drugs that Rudolph Hess had brought with him on this flight, in his flight kit.
Wow.
It was just, to me, it was hysterical. And I knew as soon as I found this thing in the intelligence papers, this whole list was going in my book. So,
wow. Great question from Dick Herman, or Hermann, German. So Dick, how can it be explained how someone who grew up and lived his life in an aristocratic bubble segued into a real man of the people during World War II? And I will caveat, although he was born at Blenheim Palace, he was part of the aristocracy. I wouldn't say he grew up in a bubble, but it's a great question. How does someone from that background become the man, the people's champion?
That's a very good question. Somebody else ought to answer. I mean, you know, I mean, I drill very deep on his period during the Blitz and you know, sort of the broad biographical sweep of his life. But you know, thinking about that, I think the person that could answer that question would be Candace Millard with her book Hero of the Empire, where she really sort of gets into how Churchill made himself become sort of the, you know, the hero of the empire, you know, during the Boer War and all that. So that probably has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, it's a great book. I second very strongly Erik's suggestion. And also for those who are new to Churchill on this call, Winston Churchill was half American. His mother was American, Jenny Jerome from Brooklyn. So he didn't exactly have the complete aristocratic background.
And he was nearly killed in an car accident in New York City in the 30s.
That's right, where his doctor during Prohibition subscribed to unlimited quantities of alcohol for recovery. Just a few more questions, Erik. This is a great question from Sarah Frederick. Why was the German Air Force never successful in targeting Checkers since location was not secret?
Boy, you know, I have asked myself that question over and over and over. You know, I found nothing in German, you know, translated German files about that, but it is to me also an anomaly. I mean, the place literally stuck out like a sore thumb, and the Germans knew about it. Ribbentrop had actually stayed there prior to the war.
Oh wow! I didn't.
Yeah. And one of my favorite also parts of the book, which to my knowledge is brand new, is the whole security kerfuffle after a pair of RAF reconnaissance pilots were flying over Checkers just to see what kind of a target it presented, and discovered an anomaly about the landscaping that made it even more vulnerable than anybody could have imagined. Essentially, a long, pale driveway ending in a half-circle pale driveway that at night, when there was a full moon, luminesced. It was like saying, here, blow up Checkers, which led them to some very funny ways that they were going to try to resolve the problem. I can't do it justice to talk about it, but it's quite fun. Interesting. But yes, that is a really valid question.
Yeah. David Stewart asks, how do you determine when to leave room for creative speculation and when to stick with what's completely verifiable?
I don't do creative speculation.
Yep.
I mean, my feeling is if you have an idea, you know, it takes me a year to find the next idea because I'm looking for things that will work on a lot, you know, click on a lot of different cylinders. And one of the things is, yeah, when you're doing what's referred to as narrative history, which this is, you can't make it up. You can't do composite characters and so forth, which some people actually try to do. The only way you can do it is if you have the material. One of the beauties of writing about Churchill is because the material is there. You don't have to make up anything. I mean, I suppose you can speculate about what Hitler's motives were, about, you know, why, and I think I do bring out some of the speculation that others have made in the past about like why Hitler stopped his armored columns just as the British and French were you know, all gathered in and around Dunkirk. Why did he stop his armored assault for essentially a day, a catastrophic error? And the speculation, nobody really knows, but there's speculation about why that was the case. But when you have enough stuff, you've got Mary Churchill's diary, you know, I don't know, you don't need to do anything.
Well, I'd like to end on a short discussion on why are we still talking about this 81 years on?
why are we still talking about this 81 years on? And why are we
What's
still
the
loving it?
legacy? Yeah.
Why are we still loving it? I think what it is that I think it's that clarity of leadership. I really think it is. I think we talk about Churchill's legacy. I think his legacy is that he stands as a model of how good leadership, or great leadership, and that's not to say he was a great leader in all things. He was not. But how great leadership in a particular time and a particular situation can help a public, can help a nation confront the unimaginable. And I think that's why he continues to have this incredible appeal.
Yeah. And I actually have one final great question, which just came in from Natalia Danello, a good friend of the society. And if you're researched, so this is based on your research. She asked, is there a link between the Blitz ending on May 10th, 1941, and the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941?
Yes.
And do you know if Churchill recognized this?
I say what?
If Churchill, if Churchill recognized this or had any information about it?
Yeah, initially when the Blitz came to an end on May 10th, I mean, it was really like a cartoon character skidding to a halt. I mean, people woke up that morning and they were just like, why is it quiet? And it stayed quiet and quiet. It became very apparent, of course, when when Hitler turned his attention on the Soviet Union, that he had other fish to fry, and it became very clear that he had drawn his aircraft from the British air campaign, the campaign over Britain, to participate in the Soviet campaign, Soviet invasion. So there's a direct one-to-one connection. Whether Churchill recognized it fully at the time as it unfolded, not super clear.
Yeah, and I will end with my last comment about the book, which I could spend hours on. I really could. Your discussion of the development of the German radar system, not radar system, excuse me for lack of a better word, navigation system, is one of the many stories you do so successfully with weaving it into. But even with those advances, they couldn't break the spirit, and they didn't accomplish their mission. And you talk about one flyer, excuse me, who kind of recognized that, a German pilot who recognized that it just was all for naught.
Yeah, no, the one thing that also appealed to me, I tried to bring in the German side as well in different dimensions. So I decided to focus on a particular German ace, Adolf Galland, who's a very compelling character, and he realized that the experience that he and his fellow fighter pilots and bomber pilots and so forth were experiencing on a daily basis over Britain with the RAF and their spirited attacks and so forth was very different than the sort of happy illusion that Hermann Goering was trying to paint for the higher-ups, for Hitler and for Joseph Goebbels and so forth. And that to me was a real eye-opener. I mean, this was not the Luftwaffe was not this German monolith. It was all these different layers and all these different attitudes toward the war and how it was being executed.
Well, Erik, I greatly appreciate your time. I know all of us did. We had almost close to 800 live attendees. So thank you all for joining us. And Erik, thank you, of course, for your time. When the book comes out in paperback, let's do this in person.
Yeah, well, I sure hope so. Then drinks afterwards at the Hay Adams. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed this conversation, Justin.
Thank you. And you can purchase Erik's book at any major retailers, but of course, your local independent bookstore, I'm sure, carries it as well. So thank you, Erik, and thank you all for attending. And please join us for our next event, which will be announced soon. Thank you, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Take care.